Look it up.
Now, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture in our series, Money Talks. The topic tonight is Social Security Reform and Investment Lessons. I'm Ruth Wilson from the Adult School, and I am very pleased to introduce the speaker, Burton Malkiel, also a friend. Professor Malkiel is, as he says on the board, the Chemical Bank's Chairman's Professor of Economics. I find that very hard to say. It's an awkward title, but that's what he is. He can explain it if he wants. He has also served as Dean of the Yale School of Organization and Management. He's probably best known to all of us for his book, A Random Walk Down Wall Street, which has published the 8th revised edition in April of 2005. Professor Malkiel holds a BA and an MBA from Harvard and a PhD from Princeton University. Please welcome Burton Malkiel.
Thank you, Woody. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm delighted. To tell you, one of the things that's such a change from teaching my undergraduate class, which I did this morning. Now, the undergraduate class starts at 9, and by 9:05, I'd say probably 60–70% of the people are there, and by 9:10, the rest of them are there. You guys are here early. We started 2 minutes early, and nobody's coming in. So that's a big change for me. I am going to talk about Social Security reform and the role that private accounts may or may not play in strengthening the system. And if you say you don't like private accounts, let me say that I think you still should be interested in listening to how you might design a system of private accounts, because most people, even those who don't like private accounts, think that possibly as an add-on to the present system, that private accounts might make some degree of sense. So I know a number of people are very much opposed to the idea of private accounts, but hold, keep an open mind about it, and we'll see in talking about the design of a system, we will see that a good design could have very important uses, even as an add-on to the Social Security system, and not a replacement for part of it. Since I've got a lot of numbers I'm going to show you, let me just sort of put you all in the right mood at the beginning. Let me start with a story. And it has a point, as you may see later, later in the evening. And it has to do with an 85-year-old couple who were of very modest means. They lived relatively frugally, and were really in pretty good health. You know, they had the aches and pains of someone in their mid-80s, but they were in really pretty good health, thanks largely to the wife's insistence on having them eat low-fat foods and doing good things like that. Well, unfortunately, their good health didn't help them, because once they were on a highway and they were hit head-on by a 16-wheeler and died instantly. They were transported up to heaven and met at the pearly gates by St. Peter. who welcomed them and said, "Here, follow me. Let me show you to your new home in heaven." And they were led into this palatial mansion, just the most beautiful home they had ever seen. And the man said, "No, no, wait a minute, you must have us confused. We've been very modest means. We can't afford this." And St. Peter said, "No, no, no, listen, you're in heaven now. This is all free. This is your reward in heaven." And yeah, they're amazed, but they go and see one wonderful room after another, an amazing kitchen. They go into this huge living room. There's a big picture window. As they look out the window, they see this most beautiful golf course that they had ever seen in their lives. And the man said, "No, no, I could never afford the greens fees." And St. Peter said, "No, no, no, don't worry about that. There are no greens fees. Everything is free. And in fact, you can have a tea time anytime you want." Let me show you, it's lunchtime, let me show you to the place where we eat. And they were led into this marvelous place where everything that was imaginable, the smoked salmon was laid out, there was the carving station, it wasn't roast beef, it was filet mignon, just absolutely amazed. St. Peter says, "This is all free, all for you to enjoy." And the man with a little consternation said, "Now wait a minute, where's the low-fat section?" And St. Peter said, "Look, that's the best thing of all. Nobody gets sick here, and you can eat absolutely anything you want." And at that point, the man turns to his wife with the crossest expression and said, "You know, if it weren't for you and your damn low-fat bran muffins, we could have been here 15 years ago." Now, as I hope you will see in a minute, that story actually has a point that's relevant to our discussion this evening. Because basically the problem of the Social Security system is that we have made promises that we simply cannot keep. We've made promises for payments to be made to current and future retirees that are simply very much greater than the revenues that we are likely to have. And you might ask, well, why do we have a problem? And the reason we've got a problem is a result of demographic change. There's a combination of the impending retirement of the baby boom generation, very low fertility rates. So we've had low birth rates for some period of time, and increased life expectancy. And these things have sort of combined together so that there has been a remarkable change in the ratio of people paying into the Social Security system to those who are receiving benefits. And we can see this on the following slide, that in 1950 there were 16 workers paying into the system for each retired person. Today there are 3.3 workers paying into the system for every retired person. And when today's baby boomers all retire, sort of in the 2020, 2030s, you will have essentially about 2 workers working for every person that is retired. And this is a combination of, first of all, increased life expectancy. People are living considerably longer today than they did in the past. And here we have life expectancy numbers that I would suggest that you look at. And you'll notice that in the 1930s, the life expectancy at birth for a male was just over 62 years. For a female, it was only 67. So you had a system in the 30s where if people retired at 65, that they would be collecting on average for maybe a couple of years. You had a system that essentially people were getting very little out of the Social Security system. But you will see over time that that life expectancy has really increased dramatically, so that for the last year in which we have figures, the life expectancy was 75 for a male, and over 75 and over 78 for a female. And that's perhaps in part the point of the joke I told you at the beginning. You know, maybe it's the low-fat bran muffins, maybe it's the fact that we're not smoking the way we used to, you know, maybe lifestyle, maybe better medical care, whatever it is, and I'm not going to argue that it's one rather than the other. What is indisputable is that now what is happening is that life expectancy is very much higher, and that in fact a 65-year-old retiring today has a life expectancy of approximately 22 years. So that there's been a dramatic change from the time the Social Security system started in terms of the life expectancy of individuals. Now, the other thing that's happened is that we've got a system where real benefits are scheduled to increase over time. Now, it gets a bit technical about the way the system works. There are two things that we want to talk about. One, the initial benefit that you get when you retire. And secondly, the increase in benefits over time. Now, the increase in benefits over time is geared to the Consumer Price Index. So that if you are getting Social Security now, since the CPI went up somewhere between 4 and 5%, they'll figure out exactly what it is. The Social Security benefit will rise by that amount of inflation from year to year. But it's also the case that the initial benefit that you get has been rising, and that doesn't rise with the price level. That rises in real terms, it rises with productivity, because the initial benefit is indexed not to prices, but to wages, and wages have typically been growing at 1% more. I mean, it's not a big deal. I mean, we hear all this about the way workers are squeezed. It's not a big deal. It's 1% a year. But as you will see in a moment, 1% a year compounds to something really quite enormous. Let me show you the real in 2004 dollars. So what we're talking about here are the average initial benefit for somebody retiring, the initial Social Security benefit. And we're going to do it in 2004 dollars, so that, you know, there's going to be inflation on top of this. We're talking about real dollars. And the current schedule would suggest that the benefits will double by 2075. The initial benefit will double. And you might say, you know, how does this 1% do that? Well, there's something we teach our students in finance called the rule of 72. If you want to know how many years it takes for something to double, you divide the interest rate into 72, and that will give you the number of years. And if something is growing at 1%, it'll take 72 years to double. If you can invest at 15%, it takes 5 years for your money to double. So basically what this is it's simply that 1% real increase in the initial benefit. And as you can see, that these things actually compound so that it makes a great deal of difference over time. And that's the current schedule. And incidentally, I might just point out here, this was not part of the original system. A lot of people say, my God, you can't change, you couldn't possibly change this indexing formula. President Roosevelt would spin in his grave. This was actually put in 1977 by Jimmy Carter. This was not part of the original system. It used to be that the indexing was to inflation. And this is basically with an additional indexing to productivity increases. And in fact, if wages start growing faster, this will be indeed a good deal more. In addition, with the benefit that we get, and I know this is controversial, but the benefit that we get that's indexed to inflation, I think most people think they didn't get enough because their market basket of goods was going up faster. But there is an argument that our consumer price index may overstate the amount of inflation because it doesn't pick up a lot of the quality changes. That the $1,000 TV set that you buy today gives you a lot more TV than the $1,000 set that you bought before. And the cars do all kinds of much better things. So, there's there's some issue that even the price indexing may, in some sense, be greater than it should be. Well, is this a crisis? Well, it depends upon whether you see the glass as half empty or half full. I'm going to give you some figures from the Social Security Administration. And this is a graph of revenues and outlays going into 2100. And essentially what this says is, right now, revenues, which is the dotted line, the dashed line, are greater than outlays. Right now, we are taking more money in through Social Security taxes than we are paying out. By 2018, that reverses. That basically says that more money will start going out than is coming in. That happens in 2018. Now, there are bonds in the Social Security Trust Fund, so Social Security could keep on paying benefits out of the trust fund, even if outlays are greater than revenues. But by the 2040s, the trust fund runs out, and you see that gap under current law and current, the way it works with current tax rates and current benefits, this gap continues to grow in the future. And in fact, if you don't change anything, eventually what the current law says is that once you run out of trust fund bonds, that you're going to have to start bringing the benefits down to the revenues. So again, this is an assumption that the tax rates stay the same, the revenues stay the same, but what would happen if you in fact just let the system run under its current under current law, but that when the trust fund bonds were all extinguished, that you then dropped benefits down to revenues. What you would be saying if you didn't change anything, that there could be a big drop in benefits that would be required. And just to sort of give you a few figures, in 2042, over 2/3 of current workers and 80% of their spouses will be alive. The median age of today's worker will be a 77-year-old male and a 75-year-old spouse. And the male would have a life expectancy at age 77 of 10 years, the spouse 15 years. And if the family is in fact counting on Social Security, and if in fact you were going to have a drop in benefits of that much, what we ought to be telling people is they ought to be saving another 2% of their income each year in order to make up for that gap. So, you know, I don't want to argue whether it's a crisis or not, but it certainly is a long-run problem. And I would argue that politically, there's an argument for trying to tackle it now rather than later. Because politically, if you try to tackle it out here, when people are facing that, and the electorate is then skewed so that more of the electorate is over 65, certainly if a part of this is benefit cuts, politically it's going to be far less easy to do that than to make some kinds of adjustments now. So, you know, it may not be a crisis, but I suspect there are probably good reasons to think of doing something about the problem now rather than later. Well, now you may say, but look, you know, we've had commissions before, and in fact we have the very famous Greenspan Commission in 1983. Didn't he solve the problem? Well, he actually did help the problem. What Greenspan did was two things. Greenspan gradually had a system of increasing the retirement age for full benefits from 65 to 67. We haven't got there yet, but you know, we're gradually going to a retirement age of 67. And Greenspan also, the Greenspan Commission suggested an increase in tax rates to the 12.4% that we have now. And the problem with the Greenspan, for a 25-year-old, the benefit reduction, the actuarial value of the benefit reduction, because the retirement age for that 25-year-old would finally be 67 rather than 65, was about 10%. So it was a combination of some benefit reductions and some tax increases, but basically it wasn't enough. You know, what's happened is the demography has changed so much that the Greenspan fix, which looked like it was going to work, what's happened is the demography has changed, fertility rates are low enough, and life expectancy is expanding so much that the Greenspan fix, in fact, didn't work. Well, it helped, but certainly didn't solve the problem. Well, what can you do? There are sort of two sets of proposals. One would be to retain the current system, but just tinker with it and change some of the benefits, or what people say is save Social Security without destroying it. Certainly no government program is so crucial to the well-being of Americans. And you know, the basic level of support that it offers in retirement is very important. It has significantly reduced poverty among the elderly. So the first step would be, okay, we're going to keep the system as it is, but we'll make some changes that we have to make, a la the Greenspan Commission. And the other set would be, well, maybe we can actually remake the system partially and introduce private accounts. Well, let's first of all, before we even talk about private accounts, let's talk about how we might save the system, keeping the system basically as it is with no private accounts. So let's look at that as a possibility, saving the present system, keeping it a defined benefit system. Let me just define for you, because this happens with corporate pensions as well. A defined benefit plan says, when you retire, you will get a certain proportion of your final wage, or, you know, it can work a different way. You'll get a proportion of your last 5 years' wages or your last 10 years' wages, but you'll have a defined amount of money you're going to get in retirement. A defined contribution plan would be like a 401k where you put your money in, you choose various investment options, and depending on what it's worth when you retire, you will have a benefit, but you don't know what it will be. So that's a defined contribution. And so basically, Social Security is a defined benefit plan. So keep it a defined benefit plan, but how could you, what kinds of tinkering could you do now that would solve the problem that I've just described? And I would argue, frankly, it's Medicare that's the real problem. It really is not that difficult to solve the Social Security problem. And you could solve it with some combination of the three things that I've got up on the screen. The first thing you could do is you could change the indexing formula. As I indicated, this is not changing, you know, this is not destroying the system. This wasn't part of the present system, the original system. This was started by Carter. You could make a big dent in that gap that I showed you by changing the initial benefit so that it rose just with prices rather than giving the productivity increase. Now, people have said that that may be unfair to low-wage workers. And so there's been a plan suggested that actually President Bush accepted, which is called progressive indexing. And what progressive indexing would do is it says, for very well-off workers, when you retire, your initial benefit will just go up with prices. In other words, the real benefit won't go up each year. But for low-wage workers, we'll keep the present formula and you will get it hitched to the productivity. You'll get that 1%, or maybe it'll go to 2%. You'll get that increase, that real increase each year. And low-wage workers have the current system, and high-wage workers would have some cut in the initial benefit. Well, that's one of the things you could do. That would be one way in which you change some of the outlays. The other thing you could do is do something that would increase revenues. And you could increase revenues in two ways. The so-called FICA tax rate, this is the revenues that come in, is now 12.4%, of which the individual pays 6.2 and the employer pays 6.2. I mean, that's the current system. It's now 12.4%. Yeah, you could raise it to 13%. You could raise it to 14%. Now, one of the unattractive features of doing that is that people worry that if you increase the tax rate, you may affect employment. Because what you're saying is, since, you know, suppose you did this to 14.4%. What you're then saying is that the cost to the company of hiring a worker, instead of wage plus 6.2%, is wage plus 7.2%. And there is a worry
that might affect employment. That, you know, if it's more costly to hire workers, you might hire fewer of them. So another alternative is that you change the so-called ceiling. Now what the ceiling is if you're employed and you make $150,000 a year, you pay the Social Security only up to $90,000. And then you pay no more. And in fact, what people find in their pay stubs, if they earn more than $90,000, all of a sudden their net wage goes up because they have gone over the ceiling. Well, if you don't want to change the tax rate, you could keep the tax rate at 12.4, but let the ceiling go to 120,000. Let the ceiling go to 130,000. The point is you can do some tinkering with the ceiling, and anything that you did with the ceiling would certainly help the situation by increasing revenues, and you could increase the revenues without increasing the tax rate. Also, the third thing you could do, and again, you can do obviously some combination of all of these things, is that you could change the retirement age. We haven't reached 67 yet, but you could accelerate the move to 67 for full benefits. Or you could make the retirement age for full benefits 68. And that might not be the worst thing in the world. There is, I think, considerable evidence that people who continue to work after their mid-60s are actually healthier. And in fact, there was a very important study from the National Bureau of Economic Research that pointed out that people who did at least some work after age 67 had reduced social isolation and considerably reduced mortality rates. So, you know, it's perhaps not the worst thing in the world to think that people might work longer than, you know, that typical age 65, 66 retirement age, and who knows, they might even be better off for it. Well, currently we're in a stalemate. The Bush administration is open to some of these changes. In fact, the Bush administration has suggested that progressive indexing might work. Bush suggested, and then the conservatives got angry at him that he would change the ceiling, but, you know, at least there has been some openness in the administration to some of those things. The Democrats have said, we're not going to talk to you unless you drop your insistence on private accounts. I mean, that's basically where the stalemate has been. That the Bush administration has said, look, you know, we'll talk about some of those things, and the Democrats say, you drop private accounts, and then we'll talk about that. But that's essentially what the state of play is now, of why, with a lot of hoopla about how we're going to reform the Social Security system, nothing has been done. So let's talk for a minute about private accounts and what some of the arguments for and against are. The proposal of the Bush administration for private accounts is that 1/3 of that 12.4% would be invested by the individual in a private account, much like a 401k that one might have at work. So Social Security would be 2/3 the present system, and 1/3 would be a defined contribution plan where 4 percentage points of the 12 would go into private accounts. And essentially the Bush administration has argued that there are some real advantages of private accounts. For one thing, that the individuals own them and control them, and the government can't take them away. If you think of private pensions now, and the crisis that we have in the private pension system, where a number of companies are going bankrupt, and there is some issue as to whether in the private defined benefit plans people are going to get all of the money because the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which stands there to help out the private plans, is now deluged with bankrupt corporations, and Delphi, the auto parts manufacturer, is the most recent one. So the defined benefit thing, which people thought, boy, this was a sure thing, we know has got some, some risk to it. And certainly the government could say, we're going to reduce benefits. So the first argument for it is the individuals control it, the government can't take it away. That individuals can then build up assets that could be passed on to their heirs. And of course, with Social Security, if you're unfortunate enough to say it's age 66 now, it's about age 66 for full benefits, you get to 66 and unfortunately you die, you get, your spouse might, say you don't have a spouse, your heirs get nothing. So here you build assets that are yours, that can be passed on to heirs. The other argument for it is that it would give workers a potential chance to earn a higher rate of interest than they get in Social Security. Now, the rate that you got on Social Security, this was a terrific deal for people who started out in the 30s and retired in the 40s and actually lived to collect. If they lived to collect, it was a great deal because they had put very little money in, got a huge amount back. The estimates now are, even if we're able to keep the benefits as they are, the rate of return on Social Security, just looking at it as an investment of the amount you put in and what you're going to get, is maybe something like 2.5%. The argument then is maybe workers could earn a higher rate by putting their money into these private accounts. And finally, the sort of argument is you would give low-wage workers the first opportunity to save and to build wealth. And one thing we know about our country is we have a savings rate, an aggregate savings rate of about 0. China has a savings rate of 40%, just to sort of put it in perspective. We have a savings rate of about 0, and in fact, low-wage workers basically don't save anything. I mean, the saving is very skewed. We have very little saving from low-wage workers. So the argument here is basically, and it's going to be mandatory, because that 4%, they can't spend it. It's got to go into these accounts. You give them a first opportunity to save and to build wealth, and this is this is what's behind the slogan of the ownership society. This is the kind of argument that you get, and. What's kind of interesting about the political debate on this, that the idea of private accounts was first suggested by a Democrat. It was first suggested by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the first real advocate of this, who made some of those arguments. We now think of it as, this is a Republican plan. It was actually first suggested by Moynihan. Well, what are the arguments against it? Well, the first argument is it's just too risky. you're going to do is you're going to substitute this most successful government program ever and let people put money into the stock market. And in fact, the way Paul Krugman puts it, because he's very much opposed to, he's, I guess, on your schedule later on, very much opposed to private accounts. He says it's like buying stocks on margin. And, you know, in a way, he's got a point, because what you're doing is you're giving up the sure defined benefit part of it. Because you see, if you take 1/3 out and put it in private accounts, you'll get 1/3 less of the regular benefit. I mean, there's a quid pro quo in the Bush plan. The third that comes out means you'll get 1/3 less benefits. So the way Paul Krugman looks at it is you're basically buying stocks on margin, because you're taking a sure thing and you're reducing that and you're putting it into the stock market. Second argument that you hear is, well, just a way for Wall Street to make money. And that's the reason that this is suggested. The third, I'm going to talk about all of these con arguments because, you know, as I've admitted to you, I find some attraction to private accounts, and I'm going to answer some of these, but I just want to go through what the arguments against it have been. The third one is the argument of the transition costs. The transition cost argument is the following. You'll remember the graph that I showed you about revenues and outlays and how these things were diverging. Well, the minute you start taking some of the revenue part out, then the divergence is going to be greater. And you'll get it back later in that, remember, from an actuarial point of view, you're taking 1/3 out of the revenues, but later on the benefits are going to go down by 1/3. So it'll be a wash, but which is why it's called transition costs. But in the meantime, the revenues are going to go down, and in the meantime, that gap is going to get greater. And I would say that the fourth con is kind of a sort of philosophical thing. That what you're doing, I mean, even if you're doing it partially, is you're substituting a defined benefit plan for a defined contribution plan, which incidentally is just what corporations are doing all the time, because the 401k is a defined contribution plan. And essentially what this does is you're shifting risks to individuals. And you are. I mean, if it's their own account, they make the investment decisions. The risk is the risk for the individual. And there's sort of a philosophical view that what a number of people don't want to have happen is shifting the risk to the individuals. And perhaps it's even more important now, where we see that defined benefit plans of corporations are in so much trouble at the present time. I mean, the airline industry is bankrupt. The auto industry is close to bankruptcy. I mean, we've got a lot of corporate defined benefit plans that are in a great deal of trouble. And there's a fifth argument against that I didn't have on the slide, and that is that a lot of people really believe that what Bush is trying to do is just kill the system. I mean, the explicit argument is, yeah, it's 1/3, but it's the nose under the tent, that essentially what he wants to do is to kill the system, and don't you dare touch this, because this is the first step to killing the Social Security system. And that's certainly another argument that you hear. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to give you a plan of how I would design a privatization system. And if you don't like privatization systems, instead of putting your earplugs on and saying, well, I'm not going to listen to him anymore, think of it then as an add-on system. In other words, you don't want to tinker with Social Security, but maybe as an additional savings system this would work. Think of it that way. So how would you design it either as a replacement for part of Social Security or as an add-on system? And we can talk about this, some of these things in the question period if you would like. But first of all, I would give people only two choices. One of the things that we know from behavioral finance is when you give people too much choice, it isn't good for them. And in fact, there's a paralysis almost when people have too much choice. And I don't want to give people a possibility of putting all the money in Enron. I mean, that was the problem with the poor Enron workers who just when Ken Lay was cashing in his options and selling off his stock, he was telling the poor Enron workers to put all of their 401k in Enron stock. I mean, you don't want to have that happen. So I'm going to give people choices. They could have either 2/3 equity or 1/3 bonds, a balanced portfolio, or 1/3 equity and 2/3 bonds. So that would be, first of all, I'm not going to let them take too much. I'm not going to let them be 100% in the stock market. I'm going to have them either a balanced portfolio, either 2/3, 1/3, or the other way around. The investing would be done by so-called dollar cost averaging, which is a sort of fancy term that just simply means that you are putting an equal amount of money in the market periodically, every quarter, every 6 months, just as you would do with a 401k. Now, the advantage of that is it's a big risk reducer, because what you worry about is, what if you start this and put all your money in the market, say you did it in the peak of the market in 1929. Well, it took you 25 years before that you were out of the woods on that particular investment. But what you mean by dollar cost averaging is, you put some money in at the worst time, but you also put money in 1930, 31, and 32, and 33 when the market was very low. And what happens is, yes, you might have lost, you were unfortunate in you bought some at the top, but you also were guaranteed to buy some at the bottom. And that's a huge risk reducer for investing in the stock market or in any market, to do this with some money periodically over time. I would also make them invest in index funds. I'm probably best known for, a lot of people on Wall Street really don't like me because I'm the one who said that a blindfolded chimpanzee throwing darts at the Wall Street Journal could select a portfolio that would do as well as the experts. And, I didn't actually mean it. I'm not suggesting that you throw darts. The right analogy is that you throw a towel over the stock market. And that's what an index fund is. You're basically buying all the stocks in the market. So I'm not going to let you put all your money in Enron or in any thing in Google or what have you. You're going to buy an index fund, and you can get those index funds privately managed at about 1 basis point, which means 1/100th of 1%. This is not going to be a moneymaker for Wall Street. This is going to be done under my proposal, with index funds, and the amount of cost of these things is infinitesimal. There would also be life cycle funds. And by life cycle funds, and I think this is actually a sensible way to invest anyway. As an individual gets older, suppose you chose the option of 2/3 equity. What I'm going to make you do, and I'm going to automatically do it, is rebalance that portfolio so that by the time you reach retirement, you're going to be in the safer mix. You're going to be more in bonds. That's what you mean by a life cycle fund. In fact, a lot of the mutual fund companies have this now. You start off with a little more equity exposure, but the risk exposure comes down as one ages. So a low risk, low cost system where you don't let people do stupid things. Does something like this exist? Interestingly enough, it does exist. This is just the way the federal thrift plan works. This is exactly the program that government workers have. It works quite well. It really has been an excellent, it's really been an excellent program. So this isn't a kind of pie in the sky. This is something that actually has been shown to work very well. Well, let me show you again. This is based on the future is never exactly like the past. But I want to show you just what that would have meant. We have very good data from 1926 to the present. And I just want to show you what kinds of returns have been available. And this is for a 50-50 portfolio, 50% bonds, 50% stocks. And the first one is buy and hold for 25 years. And incidentally, that's the other way that you reduce risk. If you're going to be in the stock market and you need money to send a kid to college, you need tuition money for next year, you don't put money in the stock market. The only way you can reduce risk in the stock market is to hold for a long period of time where the ups and downs will eventually balance out. So what this does is it takes every 25-year period from 1926. So it would be 1926 to 26, 36, 46, 50, 51, and then 1927 to 52, 1928. So it takes all those 25-year periods. And essentially what this bar is, that was the highest return you got for a 25-year period. And what I want you to focus on is the lowest return, because that's where the risk is. What you're worried about is what happens under the worst circumstances. And you'll notice that the lowest 25-year return was something in the vicinity of 5%. Now that's for a single investment held for 25 years. If you did the dollar cost averaging and said, I'm going to invest for 25 years, but a 25th of it goes in the first year, a 25th of it goes in the second year, a 25th of it goes in the third year, that's the dollar cost averaging bar, and there the lowest return, the worst 25-year period, was about 6%. Now what about a 35-year period? For a 35-year period, the risk is even less. The lowest was 7% and 8% for a dollar cost averaging investment. And in fact, if I were going to change the Bush proposal, Bush was going to let people get into this at age 55, I would have suggested that you do this only for very young workers, because the way you reduce the risk of doing this is that you invest over a long period of time. But that kind of, look, the future may not, in fact, I think returns in the market are likely to be lower in the future than they're going to be in the past. But this gives you an idea of what the fluctuations are likely to be. And if you just focus on the lowest returns, I don't find this a particularly high-risk strategy if it is, and incidentally, these are done with index funds, so it's done precisely the way that I would suggest that people do it. And I don't find that a terribly high-risk strategy at all. Let me just mention one thing about the transitions costs. In a way, if you think of the implicit gap, which people have actually estimated as $10 trillion actuarially, that the Social Security system is in the hole. If you think of that gap, private accounts don't change that at all, because while there is some transition cost, remember that the benefits in the future are going to come down. So this isn't a net loss for the system, it's just a transition loss. And what you could do is, if you wanted to make up that difference, is you could borrow it. And is that really increasing government debt? Corporations are accused of phony accounting when they hide long-term liabilities of their pension plans, which are underfunded. In a way, that $10 trillion deficit of the system is government debt, and you'd only be substituting explicit government debt for implicit government debt if you borrow to deal with the transition costs. So I'm not sure the transition cost issue is as big an issue as many people have suggested. Well, moving forward, I think we've got basically a game of chicken that's going on now. Essentially, what's going to happen for us to move forward is that the White House is going to have to drop their insistence on private accounts, and at least the official opposition to additional revenue. And then there's this issue of the payroll tax rate versus the payroll tax. And there are certainly many conservatives who, when Bush floated the idea, said, don't float the idea of increasing the limit from 90 to 150, which a number of the Democrats had suggested. So right now, if we're going to move forward, it looks like the White House, at least for now, is going to have to say no to the private accounts and no to the official opposition to revenue. And the Democrats, I think, really need to come forward with what they would do. I mean, well, as I say, what's happened is we're not even going to talk to you. But if you would recognize that whatever side of the aisle you're on, there is a long-run problem that we ought to deal with, then the Democrats really, it seems to me, have to come forward with some specifics about what they would prefer to do to maintain the long-run solvency of the system. So I think, in a way, this is sort of where we are now, and thus far, absolutely nothing has happened. It doesn't look like anything is going to happen. But if you think of this as a problem, something's got to give, and it seems to me that there probably has to be some give on both sides. Now, let me just conclude with a suggestion of a constructive step that I think, although it has no direct effect on the solvency problem that I've discussed this evening, ought to be a step that both Democrats and Republicans ought to be able to come together on. And it's certainly something I would like to see at least tried. And that is, let's do private accounts as an add-on rather than a replacement to Social Security. That there would be, it's like an automatic 401k, an automatic IRA. We know that people don't, don't save, particularly people with limited income. We could boost retirement savings on top of Social Security by requiring, think of it, you want to think of it as another 1% or 2% tax rate, but it's going to go into this account that's a private account in addition to Social Security, that would certainly help the retirement security for millions of Americans. From the standpoint of the Democrats, I would think that many of them might very well agree that this was a progressive step. I have, not that the Princeton Democrats are necessarily representative, but I find that if I suggest something like this, I've not had any problem, quite the contrary, that as an add-on, they think that this would be a very good idea. From the Republican standpoint, here's a way to actually get the private account started. And if in fact this worked well and they wanted to expand it, it probably would be a good thing from the standpoint of the Republicans to get it established this way. Yeah, it wasn't exactly what you wanted, but this was certainly a way in which we could get the whole thing started. I will leave you with a little cartoon, which if you can't see it is the guy in the deserted island, and he is basically saying, forget about me, save Social Security. So that's, I think I've taken my little more than my hour, and I'll be more than happy to try to respond to any questions you have. Yes.
Yes. This question goes to the solvency issue. Some people have suggested a value income tax on imports to be the equivalent of the payroll tax that American industry and workers now pay. And they argue that this simply levels the playing field. And my question is, what do you think of that idea?
Well, as someone who believes very much in free trade and the benefits of free trade, I would have to tell you that I don't find that idea appealing. I think, first of all, there would be retaliation. It is not at all clear that in the long run we would benefit from that. One of the things that's holding the inflation rate down is the fact that we've got imports at very low prices. I don't know whether you like or don't like or hate Walmart, but certainly millions of Americans find that this has been a way to make their dollars stretch a good bit further, and has been for certainly millions of Americans a chance to increase the buying power of their income. So my sense would be it would push us back from a free trade position that's been fortunately a bipartisan initiative. If we did it, it's clearly the World Trade Organization. This would be illegal under the World Trade Organization. It'd be like a tariff. There would be retaliation, and we'd have a lot less trade. So my sense would be, if you want to do something that is likely to hurt trade, this would do it, and it would not be something that I would recommend. Yeah.
In one of your early charts, you showed the discrepancy between receipts and expenditures, and the receipts were exceeding expenditures for many years. What happened to that surplus?
Well, it's an interesting. It is in the trust fund. There are government bonds. There are some government bonds that
reside, I think they're in Maryland. They're actual pieces of paper. So they are there. Now, the problem is it a real trust fund? I mean, basically what happened was the government spent that money, is essentially what happened. So, you know, it's a sort of an interesting thing. The trust fund is in some sense more of a liability of the government than it is in assets. And, you know, what basically happened is we as a nation essentially used it for other things.
Sort of sounds like Enron stock in the 401k.
Something to that, yes?
Okay, as I understand it, Social Security is like basic. It's the minimum you can get that makes it possible to survive. And it's based on 2%. I did my own calculations, it turns out to be right, plus inflation. It's a fundamental basic. Anything beyond that is something that would be useful for a society at every point. So how do you maintain that fundamental 2% plus inflation from the company investment you work, their gift to you, you know, and your own contribution? And say, yes, that has to stay because 2% plus inflation is the safest investment you could possibly make. It's a government bond. You don't want to get rid of that, do you?
I guess you know, and there's no doubt about the fact, and this gets into the point of, is it risky or not? What one hopes is that since those monies would actually go in to the corporate bond market and the corporate stock market and into real assets, as opposed to, you know, just being an accounting entry for the government, that in fact with the productivity gains and so forth, that you would actually be able to earn even more than that. So, I mean, the argument is, you won't do it with certainty. And there's no doubt, if you want absolute certainty, you can't do better than, but remember, the plan also is to be voluntary. So that if you think you want to have that, fine, you don't do the private accounts. Now, I think, I've got a lot of confidence in the United States economy. I really think that my combination of bonds and stocks done this way with index funds is going to earn a little more than that. But I'm not sure. And incidentally, the 2% isn't that bad a deal, because if you look at the closest thing that you can do yourself today is to buy something called TIPS, which are Treasury Inflation Protection Securities. And right now, if you try to do that on your own, you'll get about 1.5%. So, in fact, the 2% isn't that bad. Yeah, on the top.
I have a comment, but before I make it, I don't want to appear too stupid. I'd like you to correct an impression if it's wrong. I have the impression that Social Security assists orphans and disabled people. Is that a right or wrong impression?
There is definitely, and I didn't mention this, there is a disability part of it. I was really talking mainly about simply the retirement part of it, but you're entirely correct that there is a disability part of it. And my guess is that in terms of what was to be done here, I don't think anybody would want to change the disability part.
All right, because it seems to me both President Bush and what you've said looks at the whole thing as a big-time savings plan. But I think there is an insurance plan there in it. And if somebody is disabled at 30 years old and his or her income is reduced, they certainly couldn't have saved enough money to be a bunch of assistance to them at all. And if, for example, a man dies at 35 and leaves 3 children under 10, and their income, the children's income, is reduced because of this new system, I think we're doing a great disservice to disabled people and children who are currently benefiting from Social Security.
No, I think you raise a very good point. And Social Security is not simply a savings plan. And my view would be, if you destroyed the disability part of it, the insurance part of it, that would be a very bad thing. So I would clearly like to keep the disability part of it and give those kinds of guarantees. It's really only the savings part of it that I think you may want to, well, not that you may want to, that you're going to have to do something about. Because what you do know is that for the savings part of it, that isn't something that is sustainable under the current, under the current arrangements. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, I think the problem I have in looking at this, and some of what you said, is sort of context. What is the role, and what should the role of Social Security be? I don't know if any of your statistics address that. The workers that got a very good deal in the 1930s when they got their Social Security, I would bet that paid for a higher percentage of their actual cost of staying and paying their current lifestyle than Social Security would do today. No matter what happens to Social Security, I doubt if anybody in this room who was collecting it or not could afford to live in Princeton just on Social Security alone, or almost any town in the state. So a fundamental question, it seems to me, would be, what should Social Security be? And in any reform that you undertake, how do you maintain that whatever that percentage of income that you want it to be? And that's before you get to the other problem that you alluded to. How do you deal with health care, or how do you affect this at a time when, for so many workers, they are losing those defined benefit pensions that they thought they had even in retirement? So it's understandable to me that people would be very fearful of any risk at a time when all these other factors are swirling around, and we don't even know exactly what we expect Social Security to be for the typical worker.
Well, I think it ties in with the last question, and it is really where I've been a big fan of this progressive indexing. As I see it, where the system really helps is by providing some minimum level of benefit. You're right. It's not going to allow you to live in Princeton. It's not going to allow you to live in Passaic. I mean, but there's some minimum level of benefits, and it has been very effective in that by all measurements that we have of poverty among the elderly, there's much less of it than there was, and I think that you want to maintain. And that's one of the reasons why, when I was suggesting ways of doing it, where there would be some reductions in these initial benefits, for the lowest income workers, you wouldn't do that, because of what you're saying, that you're thinking of this as a kind of safety net, both from the standpoint of disability and from the standpoint of retirement. So for those workers, I suspect that shouldn't change, but I suspect what will have to happen is for wealthier workers that it will change. And these little things that you can do, like that initial benefit, it is amazing on this system how little tiny changes make billions and billions of dollars of difference after not too many years. But again, I agree with you that as I see the system, I'd like to keep the safety net part of it and do my adjusting to those in the higher income stream. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yes.
First, let me start with a disclaimer. I actually used to do advocacy in Washington, D.C.
Okay, no, listen, I knew this would be, I knew this would be controversial.
Well, the first thing is that Social Security originally was not intended to resolve all of the financial woes that retirees encounter. In fact, it's actually gone through many changes as many of the individuals within government and the legislature have seen that, in fact, many of the low-income retirees actually do depend on Social Security solely to prevent poverty, and it protects many from pushing them into poverty. And in fact, there was one time in which Social Security at one point sent out benefits when it first came out of like $2 and something cents to some people. The second thing is that the rate of return for Social Security increases as your income decreases in terms of your investment. It's progressive, and it actually gives you more the lower you earn. The third thing is that this is where I have to speak from my heart. In my opinion, private accounts are a bad idea because, in fact, that they do harm the poor. And in fact, they actually private accounts will give a benefit and advantage to higher income populations that have greater financial literacy, the time and the resources to be able to make sure that their investments are adequately made and that they gain the greater returns. In addition to that, I would posit that the transition costs. I would just suggest that the transition costs would be high. One, because it would create a very bureaucratic system that would have individuals that have people who are in the old system, people who have actually have worked both in the new system and the new system. Are just in the old system, in the new system. And that's just thank you. Next.
Okay, just on the cost of it. Remember that you're going to be part of the government computer system, and whatever system you're in, this is a programming issue. The costs of the investment you can do at practically zero. I agree with you that, again, there's a lot of progressivity in this thing, and it is a better deal for poorer people. There's no question about it. The rate of return isn't the same depending upon your income. And all I would point out to you is that, you know, some of the things that I've said and some of the issues in terms of things like progressive indexing understand that and are trying to maintain those parts of the system. You.
I think you mischaracterized the situation a little bit when you said that 40% will be in the private account, but you'll get 40% less in benefits from the when you start collecting. But really, if you're going to pay your fair share of the social benefits that Social Security takes care of now, it would be like 40% would be in the private accounts, but you'll only be getting back 50% because 10% of the 60% would be for the social accounts. So the way it's characterized in the press, is that this is a wash. You're going to keep your money, right? And you're not going to have to pay anything for that. So it seems like a good deal. But really, you're only going to get back 50% or whatever it is. If you're going to pay your fair share of the of the insurance part of the program.
First of all, I said it was sort of 1/3 and then 1/3 of the benefits. It won't be that simple because, in fact, there'll have to be some adjustment. And again, this gets back to the disability part of it. There is some part of the insurance thing that you're going to have to pay your share of. That's absolutely right. So it isn't exactly that. But again, you can make, you know, you can work it out so you pay your share and you still have your own account.
But when you add the numbers up, you know, it seems like, gee, I'm getting these free death benefits because I can now give this inheritance to somebody. That was one of your benefits, right? You get the money that's in your private account, somebody can inherit. But there's no downside